Something extraordinary happened last week that most Americans didn't even notice. A single economic decision by Nigeria, accepting payment for oil in currencies other than the US dollar, triggered such panic in Washington that President Trump threatened military action. Let me repeat that. The United States threatened war over a currency choice. In my decades of studying great power politics, I've seen empires make desperate moves as their dominance slips away. But threatening to bomb a country for exercising basic economic sovereignty, that's not strength. That's the thrashing of a wounded hegemon that's lost control of its own narrative. Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation and largest economy, didn't attack anyone. They didn't invade a neighbor. They didn't threaten American citizens. They simply announced they would accept payment for their oil in yuan, euros, or naira alongside dollars. And for that act of economic independence, Washington threatened vicious military consequences. This isn't just about Nigeria. This is about the moment when American empire showed its true face to the world. And what we saw wasn't pretty. The mask has finally slipped, and underneath lies something far more fragile than anyone imagined. What Nigeria did was technically simple, but strategically revolutionary. President Bola Tinubu's government announced that state oil companies could accept payments in multiple currencies for crude exports, not abandoning the dollar entirely, just offering alternatives. In any rational world, this would be a routine economic decision. Countries trade in various currencies all the time, but we don't live in a rational world. We live in a world where the dollar's monopoly over global energy trade has become the invisible foundation of American power. For decades, the Petrodollar system has allowed the United States to print money without consequence, run massive deficits without accountability, and finance military operations across the globe without real cost. Every oil transaction in dollars creates demand for American currency, essentially forcing the world to subsidize our empire. Nigeria's announcement shattered that illusion of inevitability. If a country sitting on some of the world's largest oil reserves can survive without dollar dependence, what stops others from following suit? Trump's reaction revealed everything. Within hours of the announcement, threats emerged from Washington. Vicious consequences were promised. Military options were discussed. The message was clear. Economic sovereignty is an act of war against American interests. But here's what Washington doesn't understand, or refuses to acknowledge. This moment was inevitable, not because Nigeria suddenly became anti-American, but because America has spent the last 2 decades teaching the world that dependence on the dollar is a weapon that can be turned against anyone, anytime, for any reason. I've watched this pattern develop for years. Every time we freeze assets, every time we cut countries off from SWIFT, every time we weaponize the financial system for political ends, we provide the best possible advertisement for alternatives. We're not just punishing our enemies. We're training our allies to prepare for the day we might turn on them too. Nigeria learned this lesson by watching others. They saw how we froze Russian central bank reserves overnight. They watched how we cut Iran out of global banking. They observed how Venezuela's assets simply vanished from international accounts when we decided their government was illegitimate. The message was unmistakable. Dollar dependence equals vulnerability to American coercion. And Nigeria, like an increasing number of countries, decided that vulnerability was too dangerous to maintain. The timing of Nigeria's move is no coincidence. Africa's largest economy has been watching the global landscape shift for years. Chinese investment in Nigerian infrastructure has delivered tangible results: railways, ports, power plants, while Western promises remained largely on paper. When Europe desperately needed alternative gas supplies after the Ukraine crisis, Nigeria found itself in an unexpectedly powerful position. But instead of simply opening the taps and accepting whatever terms Europe offered, Lagos demanded something different: technology transfers, majority Nigerian ownership of projects, and support for sustainable energy transition. In other words, Nigeria began acting like a sovereign nation with its own interests rather than a resource colony existing for others' benefit. This shift in mentality is what truly terrifies Washington. It's not just about oil payments or currency choices. It's about the end of automatic deference to American preferences. Nigeria is asserting the radical idea that Nigerians should determine Nigeria's economic policies. Trump's military threat exposed the intellectual bankruptcy at the heart of American foreign policy. When you can only respond to economic independence with violence, you've revealed that your influence was never based on attraction or mutual benefit. It was always based on fear. The countries watching this confrontation aren't impressed by American power. They're alarmed by American desperation. When the world's strongest military threatens war over a currency decision, it sends a clear message. The empire's economic foundation is crumbling, and it will lash out at anyone who exposes that weakness. But Nigeria isn't backing down. President Tinubu's response has been masterful. Calm, measured, but absolutely firm. He's emphasizing that Nigeria seeks partnership, not confrontation. He's stressing that economic sovereignty is non-negotiable. And he's making clear that decisions about Nigerian currency policy will be made in Abuja, not Washington. Behind the scenes, Nigeria has been building exactly the kind of coalition that makes American military threats politically costly. Coordination with the African Union to invoke collective security provisions, outreach to BRICS nations, engagement with European powers uncomfortable with American economic bullying. The strategy is sophisticated asymmetric resistance. Nigeria can't match American military power, but it can make military action so diplomatically expensive that even a hawkish administration thinks twice. More importantly, Nigeria is tapping into a global sentiment that's been building for years. The world is tired of American financial coercion, tired of being told that economic choices are acts of war, tired of a system where one country's currency dominance becomes everyone else's vulnerability. This is why Nigeria's stand resonates far beyond Africa. Every country that has ever felt pressured by dollar-denominated sanctions is watching. Every nation that has been threatened with financial isolation for pursuing independent policies is taking notes. They're seeing that resistance is possible, even against the world's most powerful empire. The broader context makes this moment even more significant. We're living through the end of the unipolar era, that brief historical period when American preferences automatically became global realities. The world is becoming multipolar again, with multiple centers of power and multiple options for economic partnership. China now offers infrastructure investment without political lectures. Russia provides energy cooperation without regime change demands. India offers technological partnerships without ideological strings. For countries like Nigeria, this proliferation of alternatives represents liberation from forced dependence on any single power. The American foreign policy establishment hasn't adapted to this new reality. They still operate under the assumption that threats and sanctions can compel compliance, that economic coercion is a substitute for diplomatic engagement. But coercion only works when targets have no alternatives. Nigeria's currency decision is proof that alternatives now exist. What makes this particularly dangerous for the United States is the precedent it sets. If Nigeria can successfully resist American economic bullying, other countries will take notice. The dam holding back de-dollarization could burst rapidly once momentum builds. Saudi Arabia has already begun accepting yuan for some oil sales. India and Russia trade increasingly in their own currencies. China and Brazil have established currency swap agreements. The BRICS expansion has created forums for coordinating alternatives to dollar-dominated trade. Nigeria's move isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a global pattern of countries reducing their exposure to American financial weapons. Each time we weaponize the dollar, we accelerate this trend. Each threat we make strengthens the case for alternatives. The human dimension of this crisis is often overlooked, but it's crucial for understanding what's really at stake. Nigeria is a country of over 200 million people trying to chart a course toward prosperity while managing enormous challenges. Ethnic tensions, religious divisions, climate change, poverty, corruption. American policy toward Nigeria has often treated these challenges as opportunities for leverage rather than problems requiring cooperation. We've lectured about governance while ignoring how our financial policies make good governance harder. We've demanded political reforms while maintaining economic relationships that primarily benefit American corporations. Nigeria's currency decision represents a rejection of this paternalistic approach. It's an assertion that Nigerians are capable of making their own economic choices and that those choices should serve Nigerian development, not American geopolitical interests. Trump's military threat in response to this assertion reveals the ugly truth beneath American rhetoric about democracy and sovereignty. We support democracy when it produces outcomes we like. We respect sovereignty when it serves our interests. But when countries exercise genuine independence, we threaten them with violence. This hypocrisy hasn't gone unnoticed in Nigeria or anywhere else. African civil society in particular has framed the current confrontation in explicitly post-colonial terms. They're drawing parallels to leaders like Patrice Lumumba in Congo and Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso. figures who prioritized African interests over Western demands and paid the price. The question Nigerians are grappling with is profound. Is it safer to submit to American economic dominance or to assert sovereignty and face the consequences? The answer reveals something about national character, about the willingness to accept dignity over dependency. What's remarkable is that Nigeria seems to have chosen dignity. Despite the risks, despite the threats, despite the enormous power imbalance, Africa's largest country is standing up to the world's most powerful empire. That takes courage, but it also reflects a calculation that submission carries greater long-term costs than resistance. The climate dimension adds another layer of complexity to this confrontation. Nigeria is highly vulnerable to climate change. Rising sea levels threaten Lagos. Desertification drives conflict between farmers and herders. Extreme weather events devastate infrastructure. Nigeria's strategy has been pragmatic. Use current fossil fuel revenues to fund development and climate resilience while gradually transitioning to cleaner energy. But Western nations, having industrialized using fossil fuels, now demand immediate decarbonization without providing sufficient financial or technological support. The result is a false choice between development and environmental responsibility. Nigeria is being asked to forgo economic growth for climate goals, while the countries making these demands refuse to provide alternative pathways to prosperity. Nigeria's currency diversification is partly a response to this impossible position. By reducing dependence on Western financial systems, Lagos hopes to maintain policy autonomy over its energy transition. They want to develop sustainably but on their own terms and timeline. Trump's military threats complicate this delicate balancing act. They force Nigeria to spend resources on security concerns rather than development goals. They create international tensions that make cooperation on climate issues more difficult. They turn environmental challenges into geopolitical weapons. The intelligence dimension of this crisis is also worth noting. Nigeria's ethnic and regional divisions make it vulnerable to the kind of destabilization tactics that have been used elsewhere. The predominantly Muslim North has different economic priorities than the largely Christian South. Separatist movements, insurgencies, and a history of military coups provide potential pressure points. If economic pressure and military threats fail to bring Nigeria into line, more subtle forms of interference become possible. History shows that when direct coercion fails, supporting internal opposition becomes the next option. Nigeria's leaders understand this, which is why they've been so careful to maintain national unity while asserting international independence. Nigerian civil society has been remarkably vocal in framing the current crisis as a test of national sovereignty. Academics, journalists, and activists are drawing explicit parallels to historical struggles against colonialism. There's recognition that resistance carries risks, but also understanding that continuous acquiescence perpetuates dependency. This domestic support gives the Nigerian government strength in its confrontation with Washington. Unlike imposed leaders or illegitimate regimes, Tinubu's administration can credibly claim to represent popular will in asserting economic sovereignty. The regional implications extend far beyond Nigeria. Other African countries are watching closely to see whether American threats can still force compliance. The outcome will influence decision-making across the continent. If Nigeria successfully maintains its currency diversification despite American pressure, it will encourage similar moves elsewhere. If threats and coercion succeed in forcing reversal, it will reinforce the lesson that challenging dollar dominance remains too dangerous for most countries to attempt. Either way, the precedent set in this confrontation will shape African relations with global powers for years to come. The stakes couldn't be higher for both American influence and African independence. Looking ahead, several scenarios are possible, none of them particularly comfortable for Washington. Nigeria could continue gradual de-dollarization, inspiring others to follow suit and accelerating the decline of dollar hegemony. American threats could escalate to actual military action, with catastrophic consequences for both countries and global stability. Or some face-saving compromise could emerge that allows both sides to claim victory while avoiding immediate confrontation. The most likely outcome is continued tension without resolution. Nigeria is unlikely to reverse course completely, having invested too much political capital in asserting sovereignty. America is unlikely to accept the precedent of successful resistance to dollar dominance. The result may be a prolonged standoff that gradually normalizes alternatives to dollar-dominated trade. What's certain is that this moment represents a turning point in how the world relates to American power. For decades, economic coercion was America's preferred tool for managing global politics, cleaner than war, quieter than invasion, but often just as effective at ensuring compliance. Nigeria's resistance suggests that this tool is losing its effectiveness. When countries can survive American financial pressure by finding alternative partners and payment systems, the foundation of post-Cold War American hegemony begins to crack. The empire's response, threatening military action over a currency choice, reveals both the importance of this foundation and the desperation felt as it erodes. We're witnessing the moment when a superpower's primary tool of influence breaks in its hands. The question now is whether America can adapt to a world where economic sovereignty is possible, or whether it will cling to failing strategies until they drag the entire system down with them. Nigeria's courage in asserting its independence has forced this question into the open. How America answers will determine not just the future of dollar dominance, but the shape of international relations for decades to come. Standing at this crossroads, Nigeria has chosen dignity over dependency, sovereignty over submission. The consequences of that choice will echo far beyond Africa, inspiring others to question whether American economic dominance is as permanent as it once seemed. In breaking